So let's now switch to focus on the main presentation. The main presentation is from somebody that we wouldn't normally have the opportunity to hear a presentation from. At this time of year, Roland would be on the trade show circuit of the woodworking shows, and he would be making presentations in front of large audiences all over the country. But as with everything else that I've alluded to, you know, there are real downsides to the situation we're in with COVID, but there are some silver linings if we look for them. And one of them is that we were able to get somebody like Roland willing to present to us. His presentation is going to be on the theme of coloring wood. And, you know, when I first talked with him about this, I was told that this isn't just a coloring wood from the perspective of chemical reactions of gases and dyes and stains. It's a much more holistic approach to thinking about coloring wood. And I kind of came away with a real impression that this was going to be a way to think about coloring from before, during, and after, how to practice, how to plan in advance, how to test what things will look like. I think we're going to get a lot out of this. He's been writing for Fine Woodworking for over 20 years, and then he's been on the show circuit for many years. And so this is something that he's got ready for us. It's something that we're able to tap into. And I'm just really pleased to have Rolly here. The one thing I want to just tell you folks, though, is that he is in, and he's in middle of nowhere in Minnesota. Nice. Okay. And so the reason I tell you that is he and I went through a few practice sessions in advance of this. And his connectivity, because he's on a 40-acre plot of land with creeks and meadows and forest, several buildings on his compound, et cetera, he's not right next to great data connectivity. So he is maybe going to go in and out a little bit, but we have done this and he always comes back. So if you see that it goes out a little bit, don't worry, it'll get good again shortly afterwards. And with that kind of ominous intro, Raleigh, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Okay, yeah, I'm the bad penny. I always come back, right? Well, hi. It's nice to see all the little faces up on the top of the screen here, and nice to be part of this. Yeah, I've been doing finishing. That was one of the things that got me into woodworking many, many years ago, and I've been doing finishing for an awful long time, staining, coloring wood. And one of the things that I won't be able to do here because we don't have, I don't have a crowd. One of the first things I ask people, I ask the group is, how many people work with color and color their pieces? And you'll tentatively get a hand or two here, you know, and I'll say, yeah, that's pretty typical. Most people are intimidated by using color. Because it's probably one of the quickest ways that they can turn a nice project into an absolute rolling disaster. And but we're going to talk about that tonight. We're going to talk about ways to get away from having a rolling disaster. We're going to talk about some of the basic ingredients involved, but one of the things that I've always gotten a kick out of is I've judged a number of woodworking shows, and you walk into a display where there's maybe a couple hundred pieces of furniture, and you see tan, and you see darker tan, you see lighter tan, you see some brown, you see some white, and once in a while, way across the room, you'll see something that's bright blue or red or something really interesting, and that always draws me in because the color can really make a difference. But after the event, I'll ask some of these people, gee, you know, that piece would have really been incredible. I mean, it was a nice piece, but a little color would have really done something for that piece. And of course, they'll say, I would never do something like color the natural beauty of wood. And I always want to kind of say, oh, BS, you know, you're afraid that you're going to destroy the piece. And that's what it comes down to. But coloring is, well, we'll throw a screen up here. Coloring is something that that can make such a difference on a piece. Let's see, we'll be up here in just a second, I believe. Now there's a good example. That's a very simple piece of furniture, slight curves on the front of the drawers, nicely proportioned, 3 boxes basically. And without color on it, it would be a pretty boring piece because it would be 3 boxes. All 3 of them, the bottom one, that's the natural color of the veneer that's on there. But the top 2 pieces have both been dyed, and it really makes the figured wood pop. You can see it much better. And just the contrast that you get from a very neutral looking piece to something that's pretty flamboyant, and then the dark base to settle it. And it really can make a difference in a piece. And it's a lot of fun to mess around with. Coloring is one of those things that people don't tend to practice. They don't mess around with it. It is messy. It's can be fairly odorous if you're using good quality stains. But it's the kind of thing where once you get into it a little bit, get some nitrile gloves, get a good mask, put down paper over the top of what you're working on so you don't mess up anything you don't want to get messed up, and just spend a day out there messing around with colors. A great place to find stains is ask your friends. A lot of them have stains sitting around that they haven't used in a long time and don't intend to use, and it's just fun to practice. Okay, now the methods of coloring wood. There are several different ways. We've got stains and dyes, and the difference between a stain and a dye is the size of the pigment. Now, a stain is typically earths, dirt, basically. Some of the stain colors are man-made, but these earths are ground up into a fine powder, and they're mixed into a vehicle. And if it's a good stain, typically the vehicle is going to be mineral spirits, good quality mineral spirits. I don't work with water-based products per se. I've grown up with oil-based products, used them for years. I find they're much more controllable than water-based products, a little more odorous, but control is really important, and cleanup is a little more work, but well worth it. But what a stain basically amounts to is it's pigment, finely ground dirt. It's put in a vehicle, typically mineral spirits, and then there's a varnish in there that's called the binder. And what the varnish basically does is it glues the dirt to the board. If you didn't have the binder in there, you could put that stain on, and once the vehicle, the solvent disappeared, you could literally take a brush and brush the majority of that pigment off the board. So you have this binder that binds it to the board, and it needs that because the pigment is fairly coarse and it needs structure on the wood to give it color. One of the reasons that a stain will work really good on a ring porous wood, something like red oak or ash, stain works beautifully on it. Stain works horribly on something like maple, because maple doesn't have much surface texture, and you need that surface texture for the pigment to settle down into. You need that porosity. Now, it'll work pretty good on softwoods, sometimes too good. You get egregious coloring on softwoods because of the amount of porous wood. That's the kind of things that you learn when you start experimenting with it. But a good quality stain can make all the difference in your project. Now, here are several stains. General Finishes makes a really good quality stain. Their pigments are finely ground. They have a really good varnish, a really good binder that dries fairly fast and works well. I use General Finishes quite often. If you only have big box store availability of products, Varathane is an okay stain. The pigments aren't quite as nice. It's a little harder to work with. You don't get quite as rich coloring with it, but with some experimentation, you can get acceptable results. Now, there's another big box store product on the market. I won't mention its name, but it comes in a yellow can. That is really a do-it-yourselfer, homeowner type stain, and it's really hard to work with. You don't get really good results, and it just not a lot of fun to work with. So good quality stains. If you have a professional paint store nearby, you'll see down in the lower right-hand corner, there's a can there that says Old Walnut, and it's got the name of the paint store that I deal with quite often. And those are real high quality stains. They're considered to be architectural grade stains. And again, finely ground pigments, very nice to work with. You get real true colors with them. So as in everything, you know, the better quality products are going to give us better results. So spend some money on your finishing products. One of the things that I always get a kick out of is you'll have somebody they'll spend $600 or $800 on a nice pile of cherry to build a nice little sideboard, and they spend 3 or 4 months building it. And when you get to the end of the project, you're in a big hurry and you really want to make that cherry look like the dark cherry that we all want. So you run down to a store, you buy an inexpensive stain, you come back, slap it on the piece, and it looks horrible. And now you're crestfallen because you've spent all that time on the piece and it looks terrible. So, and I always ask people, I have people call me up and say, oh, you know, I put some stain on this piece and it's just terrible, or put some dye on it and it's just, oh, it's all blotchy. And first thing I'll ask them is, how did your sample turn out? And you get that deer in front of the headlight look, and they didn't make a sample. And that's another really big part of this, is when you're working with this, make a sample. When I'm teaching woodworking classes where we're actually going to be finishing, applying a finish on the piece, I talk to the students about what they want to do. If they want to leave it natural, if they want to go with a stain or a dye, which I encourage for the experience. And what we do is right off the bat, we take a piece of the project wood from their project. You plane it, you sand it, you do whatever you're going to do through your piece and get it to a finished quality. And then you apply the stain and your complete finish to the project. So you know what it's going to look like. You have a nice big sample of it. You can plane that finish off and utilize that board in your project. But this will give you an absolute positive guarantee that you're going to get what you want. If you don't like what you see, you plane it off and you do it over again. And you write down every step when you're doing this, every step in the process, everything you've done, whether you've raised the grain and knocked it back down, whether you've used a sealer before you started, every little piece you write down so that when you get to the end of your project, you can quickly run through it again, make another sample to make sure you still have the consistency, then jump onto your piece and finish it. And by doing that at the beginning of your project, it takes all the stress away. A lot of people really get wound up by the time they get to the end of the project, because when you're done with your project, you have to put finish on it. And that can be real intimidating. I was teaching a class up in Portland a few years ago, and there was a surgeon that was taking the class, and it was a finishing class, and he was just excited about it because he said, now I can complete all my projects that I've done through the school here. And I said, you don't have them completed? And he goes, no, because if I complete them, then I have to finish them. So he decided that as long as he wasn't completing his projects, he would not have to finish them. So we got that taken care of. We worked that out. But stain is probably the most approachable for a lot of people because it is somewhat easy to manipulate. The pigment is fairly big. It gets down into the figure of the wood. If everything goes sideways for you, it's easy to strip that stain off, to get the color out of the pores of the wood, get it cleaned up, and you're off and ready to start over again. The next product is something called dye. And I tend to use dyes a lot more than I do stains. Years ago, I used stain all the time because it was a little easier to manipulate. It was a little easier to back up from, but you don't get the color that you do with a dye. Now, the difference between a stain and a dye is the dye has a really tiny pigment. It's crystals that are chemically grown. They refract a very specific spectrum of light. so you can get consistency of color when they're blending these powders together. And there's one company in this country that makes the powders that everybody uses, and that's Lockwood. What is it? WD Lockwood or something like that, a couple of initials. Lockwood makes the powders. Other people buy up the powders like J.E. Moser and the Trans Tint stuff. They buy the powders, they blend their own colors and create their own product. But these crystals are really tiny, and they literally get down around the fibers of the wood. Now, there's the old phrase that they penetrate the cell wall, so they don't do that. You know, they aren't that small, but they do get in around the fibers, so they tend to saturate the surface. They go a little deeper into the wood. That's one of the problems, is if you have to back up, it's a little harder to get that color out of the wood. But what they don't do is they don't occlude the surface. They don't fill up the porosity. They don't hide the grain. What you see is the grain of the wood, only it's colored. And you can get some really beautiful colors. You can get all kinds of stuff. You can blend your own. You can buy some really vivid colors. Many years ago, I did an entertainment center for a real Vikings fan down in the Minneapolis area, working with a designer, and he wanted it Viking purple. It was all curly maple, and I blended a dye together to give him Viking purple. And it was actually very, very amazing what curly maple looks like dyed purple. So it's a lot of fun to deal with. I had a chair in my kitchen, that little hoop back chair, banging around the shop for years, and didn't quite know what to do with the color on it. So one day I decided I want a green chair in my kitchen, bright green chair. So I found a green dye that was just absolutely an emerald dye. I still have some of it here. And I dyed that chair an emerald green. And then I finished it with gloss lacquer. So not only was it emerald green, but it was shiny. And put it in the kitchen. And we've got, in our kitchen, we have a lot of wood. Wood floors, wood walls, wood ceiling. It's open beam ceiling. It's pretty kind of rustic. And people would come in and they'd notice that green chair, and they just, wow, that's really cool. I have a lot of plants in there too, so it went with the plants. And my daughter, youngest daughter, really liked the chair, and she always said that I should make one for her and dye it green. And we get together with our family for Thanksgiving, and this is 6-7 years ago. After the family was there, we moved stuff around the house. We have a fairly small house. After everybody had gone, we're putting stuff back, and I asked my wife, I said, where's the green chair? And she goes, I don't know. I thought it was in the kitchen. We looked all over for it and couldn't figure out what we did with it. And all of a sudden I get a little ping from my daughter, and it's a picture of my green chair in her kitchen with a little phrase underneath saying, haha. And she has not given it back. She won't. She said, you're never going to get around to making one for me. I can tell. So she's keeping that one. But that's the kind of thing that color does, is it took something that was just very plain, very ordinary, and turned it into something pretty exceptional. And dyes are actually pretty easy to manipulate. You just need to know a few facts about, some pre-treatments, different things like that. And I'll tell you about it, but the way you really find out about it is to experiment. I'll give you the information, behooves you to go experiment. But these are some of the dyes I use. Jeff Jewett, Homestead Finishing Products, he has the Trans Fast and the Trans Tint, really good quality products. I really like the Trans Tint simply because it's a concentrated dye, a uniform concentration, and you can mix very specific colors with it by just counting the drops of dye that you're putting in whatever medium you're using. And I typically use my dyes as water-based dyes. Now there's something called an NGR dye, non-grain raising, alcohol-based dye. You can mix your Trans Tint or your powders with alcohol, but those dyes are really meant to be applied with a spray gun. And they're a masking dye. Basically what they are is a very, very fast drying, semi-translucent paint. They won't give you the traditional dye color that you're looking for. You can mix it with mineral spirits that to me doesn't work very well. I prefer water. Now, yes, you will raise the grain, but that's not a big deal. If you raise the grain first, lightly knock the fuzz off, and then go ahead and dye, you'll greatly reduce the amount of grain raise that you have. But those are the two most common ways of dealing with color, is the stains and the dyes. And again, the dyes get around, they don't fill up the grain of the wood. You see the full chatoyance of the wood. I've seen, you know, fairly heavy stains put on pieces where those pieces look like formica because they don't have that depth. They lack that chatoyance. And the chatoyance is how the light refracts and bounces back to our eyes. When you fill up the pores with pigment, you don't get as much refraction. You don't get that depth. With dye, you aren't filling up that porosity, so the light can actually get down into those cavities and reflect back to your eyes or refract to your eyes, and you will see that depth of grain. The third way of coloring wood is reactive dyes, and reactive dyes are pretty interesting. I put potassium dichromate, little bottle of it up there, not to use. That used to be a favored way of dealing with maple to give it that nice golden color. And I think it was used in a variety of other colorings. Potassium dichromate is very, very poisonous. It's very toxic. You don't want to mess with it. So I put it there just to tell people, don't mess around with it. There are much nicer ways to work with reactive dyes. Now, the easiest one that I deal with is what's underneath there. And, you know, it looks like red water. The jar in the back is heavily brewed tea. What that is in the jar up front is something called ferrous oxide or ferrous acetate. And it's basically rust in liquid form. And it reacts with the tannic acid in your wood and turns that tannic acid black. And it's something that's called ebonizing. Great fun to work with. It's something that you can use to give more depth of color to a piece or change the color if you're going to dye it or stain over the top. And the nice thing about a reactive dye is it does not change any of the wood refraction, none of the chatoyance at all. All the chatoyance is there. This actually chemically changes the color of the wood. Now, the way you make ferrous acetate is pretty easy. You get some fine steel wool, 3/0, 4/0 steel wool, clean it with some alcohol to get any oils that are on it off of it, stuff that piece of steel wool in a jar and fill that jar up with vinegar. And you can let it sit for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours a day, whatever you want to get different concentrations. Now, when you first do that, it's going to be a clear liquid. It can actually, if you let it sit long enough, it'll basically dissolve an awful lot of that steel wool and hold it in suspension. Once you start using it, you're going to oxidize it a little bit, and then it turns rust red. But that's what it is. It's ferrous acetate or ferrous oxide held in solution so that you can use it on your wood. And what you're going to see is a color like this. Now, it works with tannic acid in the wood. Now, maple is an okay wood to show this because maple doesn't have a lot of tannic acid in it. This was a couple of, well, I think it was a 1-day soak of the steel wool in the vinegar. You can see the background. That's the same, basically the same lot of hard maple. And this front forepiece is the ferrous acetate applied to the piece. And you can see all the chatoyances there, all the little ripples in the wood, and you can get it as dark as you want. Now, maple, again, doesn't have a lot of tannic acid in it. So if I want to get it really dark, I'm going to give it a wash of strongly brewed black tea because there's a lot of tannins in there. I also keep powdered tannic acid in the shop that I can brew my own tannins and really get a heavy concentration. If I'm doing something like ebonizing white oak, I'll give it a wash of tannic acid so that it can get just absolutely as black as possible. Great fun to work with. And the cool thing about it is if you're messing around with it, say you're doing some samples or you're actually doing a piece and you don't like how it looks when you're done with the ferrous acetate, is you can take something called oxalic acid, and you can take a solution of oxalic acid, wipe it down, and all the black disappears. Oxalic acid neutrals ferrous acetate and turns it into basically a crystal that we don't see any spectrum of light from, so it becomes essentially invisible. Oxalic acid is one of those tricks that everybody should have in their bag anyway. Anytime that you get a little iron on a piece and it gets wet and it turns it black, this will take care of it. It will get rid of that black crud that's in there. Now, if you want to learn more about dealing with ebonizing, this was an article that was in Fine Woodworking magazine probably about 18 months ago. I don't have the date on there, I should, but you can go online at Fine Woodworking and look up the article. It's a really well-written article. A young guy by the name of Michael Robbins did it, and he messes around quite a bit with ebonizing, and it works quite well. Now, there's some samples here. You can see that maple is not a real great wood for ebonizing. It just looks kind of dead if you want to try to get it really dark. Give it a light gray like that sample before. It gives that nice silvery cast that really looks nice. Cherry is okay. Mahogany, if you want to use real mahogany, you can ebonize that. But my favorite is white oak. I love ebonizing white oak because it has some really dense wood in it that does not change color. The medullary rays don't absorb enough ferrous acetate to really turn color. So you get these lighter streaks and lighter colors in a really black background. And it's just a lot of fun. It really is. And that's the whole key to this, is messing around with colors to accent your piece, to make it look different. You can build simple little boxes and stain them and dye them, and they look incredible. Lately, I've been working a lot with milk paint. That I don't put on here because it is coloring wood, but I get a lot of rolled eyes when I talk about milk paint. Milk paint's just an awful lot of fun to work with. You can combine milk paint with stains. You can put milk paint over the top of dyes and use its translucence to really change the look of the wood. So if you haven't messed around with milk paint, that's another one to add to your arsenal, is get some milk paint and start messing around with it. It doesn't lose the character of wood. You don't end up with a piece that looks just like some kind of piece of painted plastic. So a lot of fun to mess around with it. It really is. But probably the biggest problem people have with working with color is they don't do enough prep to begin with before they start putting their color on. There's nothing worse than putting on stain or dye and find out you've got cross-grain scratches that you didn't see. You've got glue smear. That's really a big one that you didn't see, because that's when things start going sideways, when you have to back up. When you are putting color on a piece, or even finish on a piece, if you're not going to color it, when you start that process, you want it to be very linear and you want it to keep moving forward. And if you run into problems, you don't want to have to back up, because if you get some glue stain on a piece where it won't accept any of the color and you got this big white glob on there, now you have to scrape and sand that glue off. And now you've got to go back and try to get the same texture on the piece, blend that into the surrounding area, restain it, re-dye it, and invariably, no matter how good you are, you're going to be able to see where you did that. Some other people might not, and you never tell them about your mistakes. You just, if they say it's a nice looking piece, nod your head up and down and shut up, because they're giving you a compliment. Take it that way. But the prep is really, really important. And one of the things that is really important in the prep is this little machine here. Now, you talk about your weird woodworking tools and hand tools. This is a vacuum cleaner, a little shop vac. I've got it mounted on the end of my big workbench here, and I use it for cleaning up my stuff. I don't brush it off. I don't blow it off with compressed air. I vacuum the crud off. As a matter of fact, I haven't swept my shop in a number of years. I use vacuums to clean my shop. No sense in putting that dust back up in the air so it lands on all your furniture and all your tools and makes a big mess. Pick it up. I always get a kick out of people who will take a brush and sweep off their bench, and then they sweep it into a pile on the floor and sweep it up and throw it in the garbage can. Well, they made a big cloud of dust when they swept it off the bench. They made a cloud of dust when they put it, swept it off the floor, and then they make a final cloud of dust when they dump it in their trash bin. So use a vacuum, clean it up. I vacuum the piece down. I've got one of these little furniture brushes that can get down in the corners. This is, I'm actually finishing this piece and vacuuming in between. But I vacuum the piece off before I start sanding. When I'm done constructing a piece, I vacuum it off. Then I'll start my final sanding because I don't want to work that dirt into the surface. If there's anything there, it just makes a big mess. And here's your real friend when you're working with this, is paint thinner. Good old mineral spirits. And you don't want to go buy a can of just mineral spirits. You want to buy paint thinner that says it is mineral spirits, because there's a big difference in quality. Just plain old cheap mineral spirits, last decade it's gotten really kind of nasty. They leave more oils in it, so the VOCs are a little bit lower. It's just not very good stuff, and you don't want to run the risk of leaving some oily contamination behind. Paint thinner, mineral spirits based paint thinner is a higher grade paint thinner so that it evaporates better. The ultimate would be to use something like naphtha, because naphtha is fully volatile and it disappears. But naphtha is kind of nasty to work with in the shop frequently. Mineral spirits is a lot safer. And the reason we use this is because we're going to go over the whole piece. Before we start sanding, we're going to go over our whole piece. Now, this sounds tedious, but it really doesn't take long. Put on some nitro gloves, throw on an organic filter mask, take your paint thinner and a nice clean cotton cloth and start wiping down the whole piece. You're going to have a notepad close by and pencil so you can write down every flaw that you see, every scratch, every ding, every dent, every glue splotch. You're going to find it, you're going to make a note of it, and you're going to rectify it before you're ready to put color on, or if you're not putting color on, before you put finishing on. But a good example is of how thorough this is we've got a cherry board. We put some mineral spirits on it, and right down the middle of that cherry board, you can see there's a problem, and that's a glue splotch. That would be catastrophic if you started putting your finish on and ran across that, because all of a sudden, bang, your stain isn't going to be absorbed, your dye isn't going to be absorbed. Now you have to scrape it out, clean it up. It makes everything go bad, and you never want to use color again, or never even want to finish your piece again. Move it around a little bit, boy, you can really see that glue splotch. Now, this is the time to find it, and there are a couple of solutions for making this very, very easy to deal with, and that's the type of glue that you use. And it's really important. And when I build furniture, there are basically two types of glue that I use. I use hide glue, both liquid glue and hot hide glue, and I use Titebond Original. Now, the hide glue, pretty obvious why I would want to use that as far as ease of cleanup. It just takes hot water to dissolve any glue splotch that you've got. I really like working with hide glue because it can give me a big open time if I add a little urea to it or use the liquid hide glue, or it can give me a very short time if I'm using it full strength and I do rub blocks or whatever I'm doing. It works great for hammer veneering. It's just wonderful to work with. I wish I could see a show of hands how many people from your club work with hot hide glue or hide glue in general. Really nice stuff to work with. If you're interested in learning about hide glue, Patrick Edwards in San Diego is a restoration guy, and he is kind of the guru on hide glue. He's got a lot of information on his website, just a lot of great stuff out there. Matter of fact, the old brown glue, that yellow bottle in the front, that is Patrick's stock and trade. That's his brown glue. Great stuff to work with. I love working with hide glue. But Titebond Original is the other glue I use. And a lot of times I don't want to brew up high glue for a project. There's no real advantage to using it on some of these projects that I'm doing, something that's more utilitarian. So I use the original hide glue. The reason I use original, there's a few of them. One, it dries a little harder than number 2. And I always tell people it's number 2 for a reason. But it's softer, you get more glue creep with it. Tight bond original dries a little harder. You get less glue creep with it. Open time is not a big deal. People get so excited about open time. If you're worried about open time, do a smaller glue up if you possibly can. And if you can't do a smaller glue up, put glue on both surfaces, because the glue will start to be absorbed by the grain of the wood. It'll do its little chemical hook, little tendrils down in. It may glaze over just a little bit from exposure to the air, but if you have glue on both pieces, they've done their chemical hook. And when you mush them together, there's enough glue moving back and forth that it'll bond fine with itself. But if there's a little skin over that glue and you put dry wood against it, you don't get a very good bond. So by doing that, you get a lot more open time. But the biggest reason that I use the Tight Bond Original is it's a PVA glue, polyvinyl acetate, but it's an aliphatic resin PVA. And aliphatic resin can be dissolved with acetic acid or vinegar. So if you have a glue smear on your piece, you can take plain old white vinegar, saturate a rag, throw it on top of the glue smear. It'll turn that glue white. It may take 10 minutes, it may take an hour. Doesn't matter. It's not going to damage the wood. You'll raise the grain on it a little bit, but that's not a big deal. We haven't started sanding yet, so it's no problem. And bingo, you got rid of your glue smear. You're back to fresh, bare, clean wood. And the acid content is so low in it, you really don't have to do anything to neutralize the acid. It's only 5% on here. But the nice thing is that if you use Tight Bond Original, you get glue smear, you're going over it with your mineral spirits, you see it, you don't have to sit there and sand and scrape and make a mess out of your wood. You just, especially like if you're putting together a panel door, you get that annoying little squeeze out in the corner that you can't clean out effectively. Just leave it in there. When it's almost completely dry, take a chisel, clean off the excess. Then when it is completely dry, take a rag that's soaked with vinegar, slap it in that corner. It'll take 10, 15 minutes. It'll turn that excess glue white. You can get in there and very easily clean it out. I typically let it dry, use a stiff bristle brush and clean it out, and it's gone. These are the things that make coloring wood easy, because you get rid of the scrapes and dings and dents, and you also get rid of glue smears, so that when you're ready to put color on, that color is going to go on very, very evenly, very consistently, and you just eliminate all your problems. Now, if you're going to pre-treat your wood, we'll talk about that in a minute. That's something that you're going to do after you're done with all your sanding. But we've got the list, and we go through that list item by item. Now, dents are really easy to get out of wood. Take a damp cloth, take some water on a cotton cloth, steam those dents out. If they're an actual puncture wound, then you're going to have to do something to take care of the fibers that are broken. Now in my shop, if you walk around my shop, you'll find that all the corners and edges on my tools are all rounded over. Nice, clean, light roundovers. All my hand planes, the front edges, the front corners, the back corners where they're machined off and they're fairly hard corner, those are all rounded over. I don't have any hard, sharp edges to bump my furniture into or to bump into my furniture, because if they're rounded over, they'll put a dent. A dent you can steam out. If they're sharp, they break the fibers. They make a puncture wound. Now those fibers can't swell and get back to where they were before. They end up locked into place. You put finish or stain or dye on it, instantly you see where they are, because the fibers are all goofy and they're going to take stain different than the surrounding area. So by making sure that everything's nicely rounded over, you save your furniture, and it's also nice for you. You're not banging into stuff and bleeding. And bleeding is not a good idea in the shop, because blood stains are hard to get out of wood. Just trust me on that. Okay, now we've gone over the piece. We've identified everything that we need to do. We've gone through and we've taken out all the glue smear. Now we're going to start sanding. And of course, people use orbital sanders. Whenever I ask this question to a group of people, beyond a doubt, everybody raises their hand. Yeah, use an orbital sander. Okay, well, now I typically have my whiteboard, but I don't have it here. An orbital sander, you know, something we learn when we're learning woodworking, like our beginning woodworking classes, when we sand a piece of wood, we sand with the grain. Now, I don't sand a whole lot anymore. I use scrapers for almost everything, but there are lots of times where I still have to sand a piece, and you sand with the grain. We know that if we sand cross grain, we're going to put scratches in there that are going to absorb dye, stain, or finish, and we're going to see them very obviously. Well, an orbital sander does this, and it's 100% cross grain scratching. That's all it does, is cross grain scratch. When we look at a piece of wood to see if it is adequately sanded, what do we look for? We want to make sure there are no shiny spots on it. We look across that wood with a raking light, and when everything is nice satin, uniform satin, we know that we've thoroughly sanded the piece. Now, when I'm sanding pieces or hand planing or card scraping or whatever I'm doing, this is my guide right here as a pencil. I take and scribble all over the board, and then I sand off that scribble, or I scrape off that scribble, or whatever I'm using to get rid of the scribble. But with orbital sanding, of course, we get rid of the scribble, but it looks satin. It looks dead flat. The reason it looks dead flat is we have all these fibers that we've torn up that are on end. Basically end grain scratches that are in circular motions. You've all seen where you dip in a little too hard with the sander and you get the big pigtail around there. Well, that's how it's sanding. So the reason that it looks dull is all of these fibers that are standing on end are refracting the light, not reflecting it back to your eye. We see that as dull. That's how satin and dull finishes are. They have a rough surface, microscopically, but it's a microscopically rough surface that scatters the light so we don't see it. So what we really want to see when we're done, we're going to go over that surface, and we're going to straight line everything, and we're going to get rid of all of that little fuzz. Doesn't take long. You know, if we've sanded down to say 400 grit orbital sander, we can take a 400 grit or a 320 grit block and quickly straight line everything. And we can use these foam blocks. I hate them because they cost money and they end up in the trash bin. I'm a cheap guy, so this bucket sits over by my cutoff saw. And whenever I have appropriate shaped pieces that I think would make nice sanding blocks, I cut them up and throw them in there. Sometimes I'll make them, those smaller blocks I make, grab a piece of sandpaper, some number 77 spray adhesive, grab up a big handful of your blocks, throw them on your bench, and arrange the blocks the way you think you need different blocks, different sizes. Arrange them on the sandpaper, throw all the other excess blocks back, take them off the sandpaper, spray some number 77 adhesive on, rearrange the blocks, then take an extendable razor knife, and from the back side, cut alongside those blocks. And what you're going to end up with is a nice pile of blocks that have sandpaper on one side or both sides. They cost you a sheet of sandpaper, a little glue. When you're done with them, you throw them back in the bin. You can use them for kindling or whatever you want. It's a great way to use up your scrap. Costs you next to nothing, and you get really good blocks. And the thing that I really like about these blocks is there's no sandpaper on the ends or the sides. It's only on the face. So if you're working with moldings or you're working up against another surface, you can literally put that block right up against it, use that as a guide to sand your piece. You don't scratch up the adjoining surface. You can go across an end grain piece, sanding a straight grain piece, and you don't scratch up either piece, only sanding where you want to sand. So they're much better than the commercially available blocks, and you'll get everything straight lined and you get it nice and clean. So we've got our list. We go through our list. We check off everything. We write it down. And I don't care if it's a little bitty side table you write down what you've got, because there may be 4 things to fix on that side table, and you'll remember 2 of them. Or maybe on a good day, you'll remember 3. Yes.
The list is of the things we find as flaws that we need to fix before we start. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
All the little scratches and dents. So you're going to go through your list and you're going to check everything off to make sure that you repaired everything that needed repairing. That way nothing jumps out at you. Vacuum the piece off thoroughly so that it's really clean. And then one more time, we get the old paint thinner out and we wipe the whole piece down. And the reason we're doing that is we want to make sure that we didn't induce anything into the project while we were working on it. Years ago, I had a set of display tables that I was making for a local designer. Did a lot of work for him, and he wanted some tables to display what I could do as far as veneering, as far as color, and yet he didn't want to take up a lot of space in his showroom, and he wanted to use those for putting other stuff on. He could take the stuff off and show people. So I had these nice tables veneered in the center. They had about a 3-inch rim all the way around that was hard maple that was just nicely rounded over. That way, if it got damaged, it was going to be easy to fix. And I had these pieces all sanded. I was already started putting the dyes on. I put mineral spirits on it, and I could see these little bitty puncture wounds around the edge of that maple. And some of them would have a few, some of them would have several, and I couldn't figure out where the heck those came from. And I'm in Minnesota. My shop is kind of cool in the winter. I wear vests a lot. I wear a big Carhartt vest in the middle of the winter. Carhartt vest has a real heavy brass zipper on it. And that day I had the vest on, but I didn't have it zipped up. And the tang on the zipper was hitting the wood when I'm reaching over, cleaning them off. And just, a nice sharp little edge on it. And just that little bit would put those little nicks in there. Well, they're easy enough to sand out because I caught them before I did the next step. So I could go in and quickly sand them out. But that would have been one of those deals where when I put dye on that first one, I would not have been happy because I would have had these little nicks around the piece. So that's how important it is to do your homework, go over the piece. This isn't a big deal to go over it with paint thinner. It only takes a couple of minutes. And there's some added benefits to it too. Not only do you find out if you've missed pieces, but you're also going to find out a lot about how it's going to absorb color when you start working with the final color. Now this piece is all sanded and ready to go. I go over it with mineral spirits. You see those dark areas? That would be blotching. I can't point to them very easily, but there's a middle board lamination, and above that you can see little dark marks. And basically what that is this is how wood grows. We all know that if you cut a board off, you get the end grain and it's got all those porous pieces in it, the ends of the cells. And if we put stain over the end grain of a board, it gets really dark because it sucks all that pigment in, sucks the dye in, the stain, whatever, and gets really dark. So we use a pre-treatment of some kind to close off those cells so they don't absorb all that dye. A lot of wood has a vagrant grain that moves through it. Curly maple is, of course, the most obvious candidate because it's got this grain that weaves its way through the straight grain. If you hand split a piece of curly maple or curly poplar or any curly wood, it's just like this on the surface. So when we make a board out of it, we plane that flat. When we plane it flat, we're opening up all of those cells that have come up to the surface. So basically what we have is we have areas of end grain on our surface, not total end grain, but enough of it's coming up to the surface that that's how we get blotching in hardwoods. Cherry is famous for that. Maple is horrendous, trying to get a really uniform color on something that's halfway figured with maple is just crazy. I mean, excuse me, curly maple, bird's eye maple, when you're planing it, dealing with it, you've got end grain on one side, flat grain, end grain on the other side, and it's terrible to have to plane. It's even worse to have to finish because you can make that curl very obvious, but obvious for the wrong reasons. You're getting these dark lines on the sides of the curl because you're dyeing that end grain. So by putting mineral spirits over it, it's going to not only show you if there's any flaws, it is also going to show you what you're going to anticipate for absorption of stain and dye. And so there are things we can do to eliminate those problems. I love working with cherry and maple, and I also like coloring cherry and maple, especially cherry. Cherry is a lot of fun. You can really mess with people with cherry. They haven't a clue what you're working with. I've been working with red alder for a few years. Red alder they call the poor man's cherry because it has a grain very similar to cherry. It's a little softer than cherry, but that's another wood that's just a lot of fun to mess around with dyes and coloring on, because people don't have a clue what that piece is made out of. And I'm not talking about people on the street. I'm talking about experienced woodworkers, you know. And years ago, I had a commercial shop, did architectural millwork. And I had a young guy working with me. There were just two of us in a 6,300 square foot shop that we had full. And we were getting wood from overseas. This designer that we worked for, he was importing wood from Malaysia. And it was, some of it was carvings and some of it was just stock to build stuff with, to match carvings. And there was a lot of stuff that we couldn't identify. So we came up with this name of Mimbiki. If we couldn't identify it, it was Mimbiki. And that's with two I's on the end, by the way, if you want to use that sometime. And so if you can't identify a wood, just call it Mimbiki. Nobody will know any difference. So anyway, I digress. Back to the problem of coloring wood that is blotchy. If we're dealing with things like ash and red oak, you put stain or dye on it, it's not a problem. They're very uniform wood. They typically don't have much for switchback grain. They finish up really nice. That's something that sanding is so important. I've had people tell me, you know, I used some stain on this red oak piece that I built, and I got blotching all over it. And you kind of go, blotching on red oak? How did that happen? And it was from over sanding with an orbital sander, not going back in and straightening up the grain. They had a lot of end grain, it absorbed stain. So that's why you can see some ring porous woods that normally are very, very easy to finish. You'll see a piece that somebody's stained and it looks terrible. It looks all blotchy and splotchy, and it's because of the way they sanded it. They didn't go back in straight line. They didn't get rid of the cross sanding scratches. But if you got everything done and you know you're going to have some problems with blotching, like with cherry or maple or figured woods, if you're working with quilted maple or any kind of figured wood, and you want to get a uniform color, there are two things that work really well. Now you can buy pre-treatments. There are all kinds of stuff. There's pre-treatments that are nothing more than white glue that's been thinned way out, and you slap that on. It works after a fact. It's not bad, but it's not very good either, not easy to control. There are varnishes that are thinned way down that can be used as a pre-treatment. Again, buying the pre-treatments that are available in the store, it's a crapshoot if you're going to be able to make it work. So I use a couple of things. I use shellac and I use high glue. Getting back to high glue. Hot high glue, thinned way down, is an absolute beautiful way to pre-treat a wood because it dries quickly. As soon as it cools off, it gels. And then, you know, if you're in a hurry to work on a piece, you can have it pre-treated and ready to go in an hour, and it's all ready to go. It will raise the grain some because it is wet. But if you raise the grain before you sand it, you're probably in the clear. And you thin it way down, you slather it on, you wipe it dry immediately. As fast as you can wipe it off, you get that high glue off. What it does is it goes into those pores, and it'll only go so far in before vacuum basically holds it up on the end of those pores, and it will dry, forming a little meniscus. Now that cell will not absorb stain or dye anymore, but it's so thin that it will literally form around all the other structure on the wood and allow penetration of the stains and dyes. Hide glue is fairly porous to begin with, so you don't get, you know, when you're working with it, you don't get the egregious glue stain that you do with PVA glues. But this really works nice. And you'll see in here, there's one bag that says rabbit skin glue. And rabbit skin glue is the bomb for making a solution to resist stain or dye. Now, there's a guy by the name of George Frank who wrote a book for Fine Woodworking for the Taunton Press years ago, Adventures in Finishing Wood. And George has all of these little anecdotes for every type of finishing problem or staining problem, dyeing problem that he talks about or method. And frequently he would talk about rabbit skin glue. Now, Frank tells great stories, or told, he's passed on now for a few years, told great stories, very entertaining book. If you want to read a fun book on finishing, look up Adventures in Wood Finishing by George Frank. And it's fun to read and you learn a lot. But I just thought it was another one of his embellishments to have rabbit skin glue. And I was looking through a catalog, it was probably 15 years ago, not long after I got that book. And it was a Liberon catalog. And my goodness, they had rabbit skin glue in there. So I had to buy some and try it out. And it really does work. It's a very high gram strength glue, 400 grams, somewhere around there, compared to 192 grams that we typically work with. It's lousy for any kind of woodworking. Artists use it for making gesso. And that's typically where you can find it, is art supply stores if you can't find Liberon's glue. But it's very hard, very brittle, but it's very thin, very nice size molecules, if you will, in it. So it really does a beautiful job of pre-treating. And again, just wipe it down, wipe it completely off. And one more thing you do, when you do a pre-treatment, after you have that pre-treatment done and dry, again, you wipe it down with mineral spirits, because you might pool some of that pre-treatment in a corner somewhere and you're not going to find it until you put your stain or your dye on it. Next thing that I use is shellac. And I use a half-pound cut shellac. And what that means is that's essentially a half-pound of dry shellac flakes dissolved in a gallon of good alcohol. And again, you just slap it on and wipe it dry immediately. It soaks down into that porosity. As soon as the alcohol is flashed off, you're basically ready to put your color on. And again, it's a good idea to go over with mineral spirits to make sure that you haven't created a problem by trying to solve a problem. And this sounds like, oh my God, why would I want to color wood if I have to go through all this? Well, once you're set up and you've gone through this a couple of times, you've practiced it, it goes really fast. I mean, how long does it take you to wipe down a piece of furniture? Seconds, minutes at the very most. And you're going to find out exactly what you have for a surface before you put the stain or dye on. Now, good quality shellac is important. So I always brew my own shellac. I buy good quality flakes. The ones in this picture, Lee Valley. I also buy from Jeff Jewett at Homestead Finishing Products. Shellac has gone up in price quite a bit in the last number of years, but it's still a very reasonably priced product. Nice to work with, totally non-toxic. And by making your own, here's a chart that I have. You can download this chart from shellac.net. It shows you all the different brews for up to 3-pound cut. But I use one of these little digital weight gauges. You can buy these things on Amazon for $15 and they're dead nuts on accurate. So I'll weigh out the shellac that I want. I put it in alcohol and away I go. And use decent alcohol. This is alcohol appliance and marine stove fuel. Higher quality than your typical big box store alcohol. But if you really want the bomb, if you really want to do the ultimate in shellac, in other words, non-grain raising shellac, because even this alcohol has some water in it, you can use Everclear. And the nice thing about using Everclear, that's 190 proof, is that you can share it with your project, because shellac is edible. And so you can have a little bit for you and a little bit for the project. And, it just makes a happy time out of your finishing. But really, if you have something that's, say, heavily carved and you want to use a pre-treatment on it because you're going to put a stain or dye, and a heavily carved piece has got a lot of end grain, and you don't want to have to sand it after you put a pre-treatment on. Make your shellac with Everclear. There's no water in it. It's not going to raise the grain. So you can put this shellac on, bingo, you're ready to start putting your stain or dye. And it makes a world of difference. It really makes just a real big difference in what you've got. Now, I've got some just slides of different contrasting samples of wood. We won't get into that. I think we've probably gotten close to using up our allotted time. But working with stains and dyes is just so much fun. Typically what I do on a piece is I'll use a dye to get the depth of color that I want without ruining the chatoyance of the piece. And then after I've put a sealer over that color, I come back and glaze it. And you can buy pre-made glazes, or you can buy gel stains. And basically what you're going to do, we'll zip down to a slide that I've got here on glazing. Okay, I'm going to use a gel stain, and I'm just going to slop it all over this piece after I've got my base color on and I've got a sealer on it. Then I'm going to wipe off the majority of the excess and clean down the areas and just keep working it down until I get to the point where I have that glaze worked into all the shadows. Now, don't look real close to this piece because I didn't do any end grain treatment, but this was just to give you an idea what you can do with a glaze over a stain or over a dye by putting a sealer in, coming back with it. This is literally painting on a color, because now you've got a sealer on it. Your wood is really not going to take much color. But what we're doing here is we're putting permanent shadows on that piece, because we can have a piece that's got beautiful ornate moldings on it or carvings, and unless you have raking light to produce shadows on it, you really don't see those carvings or those moldings. They tend to disappear. It's the reason why when you see furniture properly displayed in a museum or in a gallery, they always have raking light from different positions so that you can see all of the texture. You can see the moldings. You can see how that piece looks. If you have light that just blasts right in the front, you don't see anything. It's just two-dimensional because there's no shadows. Glazing puts permanent shadows in, and you can manipulate those shadows. You can give it a distressed look. You can give it an antique look. You can give it color. I've messed around with green and red stains over the top of another color and worked those down, and blue also. I can't think of the blue. It's kind of a light gray blue. And you work it down into those moldings, those colors, you wipe it all off, and it has this beautiful little tracing of color down in all your moldings, down around your panels, and it looks incredible. If you have carving on, you're going to get some color. And it's not like it was painted and you tried to take the old stuff off and there's some left. No, this is obviously intentionally done, because you're going to put it in the areas you want to highlight and move it away from the areas you don't want to highlight. And it just makes a piece explode. There is a place where if you don't want to stain or dye the piece, you want to have natural wood on it, fine. Put a seal coat over it and then bring a glaze in. Introduce a glaze. Work it into the corners, work it into the panels, work it into the carvings. You still have a natural piece, but now you've highlighted all of your moldings, carvings, whatever on the piece. And it makes such a difference, because there's nothing more boring than having a piece that's just natural wood that's finished. It gets a nice patina after a while, it'll get a nice color, but there's nothing that really makes it pop. Nothing that really, knocks your hat in the creek. As the old cartoons where they always had the guy with the clip brim fedora, his hat going up in the air when he got surprised. But coloring is it's phenomenal. It's so much fun. It's just so enjoyable to do. And it's easy. That piece right there, just a plain door that had a kind of a crappy color on it, threw some glaze on it, turns it into something totally different. And I've taught a couple of cabinet makers here in the area how to glaze cabinets, how to use that color. And it's interesting, you go into their display room when you first meet them and talk to them, and all of their cabinet door displays are just flat painted or sprayed, and that's it. You come back after they learn how to glaze and color, and my God, it's just, you know, it's incredible what their showroom looks like, because now they are using some interesting dyes. They're doing a lot of glazing. There are more schools now that teach finishing, that are teaching glazing. There's a lot of big, of course, big name companies. If you walk into a high-end furniture store, you see a lot of glazing, a lot of manipulating of color there. A lot of times that's to hide poor workmanship with the wood. And that's one of the last things that I'll talk about, and just very briefly, because that's a whole nother seminar, is designing with wood grain, taking into account the wood grain, your rift sawn, your quarter sawn, your flat sawn, keeping wood grain consistent. When I'm doing a set of doors, the top rail on the door and the bottom rail on the door come out of one board that's split in half, and it runs all the way through all the doors. All of my stiles, where the stiles are adjoining, it's one board that's split down the middle, and everything is very uniform. If it's rift sawn, it's rift sawn across the whole piece. If it's quarter sawn, the face frames will be quarter sawn, or the doors will be book matched, or whatever. The reason that I do that is because wood stains and dyes differently. And you can have something that looks pretty good when it's raw, but then you start putting stain and dye on it and it looks terrible, because you got flat sawn next to rift sawn. They take different color, they have different grain patterns. When I'm picking the wood for my projects, I go through and design my project. I write down what every component should be, whether it should be flat sawn, rift sawn, quarter sawn, whatever. I write down what the components are. That's part of my cut list. When I go buy the lumber, I know how many board feet I need a rift, how many board feet of flat sawn, whatever. When I'm buying my lumber, I take a block plane along and I plane off the end of the board. What I'm looking for is density of the annual rings, how close they are together, and what the face grain is going to look like. Because I can look at the end of a board and I can tell, okay, this is a flat sawn board. It's going to have a little rift sawn out on the outside edge. Rift sawn's 45 to 60 degrees to the face. But the middle is going to be flat sawn. And it's got fairly wide annual rings. So that means it's going to have real big cathedrals with a lot of space in between them. And the cathedrals are the annual rings. And they are darker than the background wood, unless you're working with softwoods where it's just flip-flop. If I have a board that's got real tight annual rings, it's going to have a lot more cathedrals. And it's going to be a wood that's going to be busier, and it's also going to look darker. So I want to make sure that I've got consistency in my annual rings. Then I look for a basic color to see if it's going to be pink or green or blue or whatever color. You can get 4 cherry boards that have nice annual ring density, and they can be 4 different colors that are going to be really hard to blend. Some will have a little green in it, some will have a little more yellow in it. So that's the next thing, is you start looking at the color. But I've seen so many pieces that were a disaster to finish before they even got the piece completed, because they didn't pay attention to grain patterns, grain density, and color of the grain. And there again, another good place to determine how your piece is going to start out is when you start working with your wood. Take alcohol, wipe down the board, and look at the color to see what it looks like. Compare it to your other pieces. If you have one piece that's really wonked out, get rid of it. Throw another piece in. I always buy plenty of lumber. I've always got uses for it, but I want to be able to pick through the lumber. And one last thing is grain direction. When I first got into woodworking, one of the first things that I did that was a commercial success was building center pedestal dining room tables that opened up, and they were pawfoot and all kinds of different things like that. And I would laminate up those tabletops and I would stain them, and some of them would be very uniform. Some of them would have boards that were very dark compared to the boards next to them. And I had been really careful about picking my lumber. Well, I started hand planing the tops of those tables because it was a lot easier than using a belt sander. And of course, the first thing you learn when you're hand planing a big surface is you make damn sure the grain is going in the same direction on that piece so that when you're planing it, you can actually plane it. If you have a board that's flip-flopped around, you're going to tear the grain up. What I found out by accident is that the homogeneity of that top was much better. I didn't have those dark boards in. And what I realized is if you've got the grain running this direction, when you look at it this way, you're looking down into the holes of the wood. You're looking on the backside, you're looking at the backside of the cells. This refracts the light, this absorbs the light. So if you've got one board with the grain running straight, lightly uphill, this is going to be the dark side, this is going to be the bright side. Now, if the adjoining board has the grain going the opposite way, it's flip-flopped. Just take a board, get it wet, look at it, turn it around, look at it. You're going to see two different boards when you do that. So when you're laminating up big panels, figure out which way the grain is going, make a big arrow on it, and make sure that all the boards in the panel or the tabletop or whatever you're doing are going in the same direction, and you'll get rid of that striped look. And that's, again, really important when you're coloring a piece, because the color, unfortunately, will accent that difference unless you're using a real heavy bodied stain and you're dry brushing it and just basically obliterating the grain. So, wow, that's a lot of stuff in a period of time. Yeah. I hope you took good notes. Well, you guys recorded this, right?
That's right. Hey, Raleigh, could you just unshare your screen so that we can actually see the real you bigger than a postage stamp?
Sure, sure. I don't know if that's a good idea or not. But...
Actually, we just wanted to see the wall behind you. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, well, here, I'll move out of the way a little bit. There, now you can really see the wall.
Gorgeous. Hey, yeah. Raleigh, I know that you had some time for us to be able to take some questions too, but I have to comment that I learned a ton, but I also learned a ton about things beyond coloring. Like, for instance, I can understand the knocks your hat in the creek expression. I'm still scratching my head about dead nuts on accurate.
Well, if you're not that accurate, there is part of that will really suffer. So,
okay. So let me just describe to folks that we have the opportunity to ask Raleigh some questions. Right now, everybody is currently muted, but if you'd like to ask him verbally, just sort of go ahead and do so. But if you're not comfortable with that, you're also welcome to put questions in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and have me ask him those questions for you. So please, somebody with a question, go right ahead.
Roland?
Yes.
Hi, hang on, I'm getting an echo here.
Yeah. Raleigh, do you...
I'm going to mute myself because this is not working.
Okay, that was Paul Duffield, who no doubt had a good question. So it's unfortunate that he had to go off.
Can he type it in?
Yeah, go ahead and type it, Paul. We'll get it asked that way. Somebody else? Oh, come on, folks. You guys are 128 people who have decades of woodworking experience.
Hey, I've got a question. This is Dan.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I had an 8/4 piece of wood that's about 10 foot long, and I'm doing that front and back cut. And I feel like the front having a quarter sawn appearance, the back of it may not have felt as quarter sawn.
Right.
Have you seen it change that much in a 8/4 piece of wood?
Oh, absolutely. In a 3/4 inch piece of wood. To get true quarter sawn wood, that grain has to be 90 degrees to the surface. That's the only way you're going to see the medullary rays, because the medullary rays come out of the center of the tree to the outside edge. That's the grain running perpendicular to the rest of the grain. And if you have rift sawn, then you're just catching little portions of those medullary rays as they come up. As you get to 90 degrees, that grain 90 degrees, you're going to catch the whole medullary ray. So you get a lot bigger flakes. You can have a 3/4 inch board where it's, just a little bit off from 90 degrees, The flakes on this side will probably be bigger than the flakes on this side, simply because you're getting a little more towards your rift sawn. Rift sawn, one of the nice things about rift sawn is it's catching pretty much the ends of the medullary rays. It still gives it that nice figure that especially oak gets. I love rift sawn oak. It's beautiful wood. Doesn't have the big cathedrals that flat sawn oak does, but it still has the color, very straight, nice, consistent grain. But yeah, take a look at the end of your board and see where those medullary rays are going. And if those medullary rays aren't going absolutely parallel with the face of the board, you're not going to get those big flakes. It's why it's kind of nice if you're starting out with rough sawn wood, you can take a look at those medullary rays. You can trim it into basically a wedge till it matches those medullary rays. Then you can go ahead and thickness your board after that. One side will typically have bigger rays than the other side. One of the reasons the veneer became popular a long time ago is they could get the big flakes all the time.
So Paul Duffield did end up putting his question here. He says that we're not able to get mineral spirits here in California, but have you ever tried using citrus solvent as an alternative?
No, I haven't, but it would probably work okay. As long as it doesn't leave any oils behind, it would probably be just fine. And it's not going to raise the grain. Well, it might raise the grain, but that's not a big deal. I mean, literally, you can use distilled water and get an idea of what you've got. It's just that it confuses it a little bit because it's raising the grain at the same time that it's showing you where your flaws are. So, hey, Arizona sells mineral spirits. I'm just saying.
Many of us know that. Thank you. Speaking of bottled substances, somebody asked if we could please bottle up your knowledge and maybe sell that. There are, just so you know, Raleigh, a lot of people who are expressing appreciation for what you've done here. A lot of good information was conveyed. It's great. Let me see what other questions there may have been.
Yeah, I see there's a couple more coming up. So, well, thanks.
Have you written a book?
Sorry, go ahead, please.
While
Have you written a book?
Have I written a book? No, people keep asking me that if I've written a book on finishing. I haven't, but I'm thinking that maybe I should really consider it. Some of the books that are out there are okay, but they're written by finishers, not by furniture makers. And that's a big difference because a lot of times finishers get the furniture after it's all built and they don't understand exactly what goes into getting it to that point. And they're just interested in putting color or finish on top of it. And one thing I'm going to talk about finishing, this is a little bias on my part, but I got into this whole world through restoration work, refinishing work. That's how I got started. And polyurethane, no polyurethane. No polyurethane. If you've ever tried to repair it or replace it. And I really don't deal with water-based products. I've experimented. They're pretty much the same as polyurethane. They're plastics. They're really hard to repair and replace. And I know you folks run into a problem with not being able to use a couple of my favorite. I've got 3 favorite finishes. I've got lacquer. I've got true alkyd varnish. I use Waterlocks because it is a tung oil based varnish, and shellac. Now I know you can't really deal with lacquer, but varnish is still available. You can get Waterlocks. It's 50 state usable, and you always have shellac. And shellac's great. The old story, everything sticks to shellac and shellac sticks to everything. It's a great sealer, primer, whatever. You can use it for a grain-filled finish and then go over it with something a little more durable like varnish to give you a really nice, durable top coat with just a couple of wipe-on coats over shellac, and you got a beautiful finish. So, but that's a whole nother seminar on hand finishing.
Got it. So Jerry,
I have a question for you. Can you comment on the light fastness of stains in dyes?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, stains are more light fast than dyes because of the size of the pigment and what the pigment's made out of. It's earths. They tend to not change the color. The drawback is that you can't get the bright, vivid colors in stains that you can in dyes. And really the only way you're going to get around keeping that color is to keep it out of the sun. Keep it in an area where it doesn't get direct sunlight. You can use UV inhibiting finishes over the top, but that's kind of a misnomer because the UV really doesn't protect the surface under it. The UV inhibitors are there to protect the finish from UV degradation. So the only thing it does is it keeps a better film over what you've done. But color fastness, there was a guy that in Canada that made a product called Woodburst dyes, and they were a real high-end pigment that he was developing, and they were light fast. I just threw away a sample that I had in my window that had bright red, bright orange, bright yellow on it, just vivid green. And that sample sat in the front window of my shop. Not a lot of direct sunlight, but it faces south. And those colors were still vivid after 20 years. But his stuff was a little bottle like this, cost about $25 20 years ago. And needless to say, he didn't stay in business all that long, which is too bad. But yeah, color fastness, you just got to keep it out of the light.
There's a question
Thank
here.
you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Conversion varnish. Have you used conversion varnish?
Yeah, we used to use it in the commercial shop once in a while on stuff. Again, I'm not a fan of it because it's too hard to repair. When it converts, when the catalyst reacts with it, it changes it into something other than varnish. True alkyd varnish, like water locks. I used to use a lot of Pratt & Lambert number 38, but it's hard to find anymore. It is so easy to repair and rebuild and replace. And that's the things that I look at is we like to think that our furniture is going to last a while, maybe a couple generations. And over the years of doing restoration work, I've seen more furniture that was just almost destroyed by people trying to repair something, and then they totally botch it, and then they try to strip it off, and it even gets worse because these finishes just won't come off. Polyurethane's horrible. Trying to get that off, especially an open grain wood, ring porous wood, it's just terrible to get it off. You have to use really caustic chemicals like methylene chloride, and that can wreck a piece. I mean, that can end up, your sideboard ends up in your grandkid's garage painted green with bolts in the drawer because they screwed up the whole look of the thing when they tried to refinish it. So true lacquer, nitrocellulose lacquer, true alkyd varnish, and again, Waterlox is what I use, or shellac. Those are three finishes that are easy to apply, they're easy to repair, and when they finally go south, they're easy to replace. And to me, that's what's really important in finishing. And there's a lot of high-end furniture makers that are the same way. They want something that is reasonably durable, but when it does go away, it's easy to repair it and replace it.
Got it. Anybody who wants to ask a question out loud, we have a couple more in the chat, which we can go to, but anybody got a question, like Kevin?
Hi, Roland. This is Kevin Deal. I do wood finishing myself.
Okay.
Do you ever have fun using UTCs, Universal Toner Colors, to make your own stained colors?
Yeah, I do. I actually have a whole mess of UTCs, and I just buy, I used to buy clear stain base. Now I just make my own.
And how about you were talking about the trans tint? Do you ever mix it with the nitrocellulose lacquer to do any toning?
No, I don't. I typically don't tone using a finish involved with it because it's too hard to control it and get a really even look. To me, it always ends up looking like it was sprayed on. If I want to introduce another color, I'll do glazing. A lot easier to control, and if it all goes wrong, you can remove it with mineral spirits and start over. So it gives me a lot more control than spray staining.
Oftentimes I'll be asked to change like a maple staircase into a walnut staircase. And I'll do a glazing like you're talking about,
Yep.
you know, after a thorough sanding and cleaning and all of that.
Right.
But sometimes you just need to tweak the color just a little bit. And I've had a lot of success with just tinting the lacquer with either UTCs or trans tints. But the trans tint is a wonderful product to use. And
It is. Yeah.
It-
I like trans.
it works fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a way to do it. You do tend to mask the look of the wood a little bit. In a situation like that, I would probably do a base glaze, put a sealer over it, and then come over it with another colored glaze, maybe something slightly different just to warm the color up a little bit so it doesn't look quite so much like it's, you know, almost painted with a heavy pigment. By using a secondary glaze over the top of a sealer, you can start highlighting stuff. You can start wiping it off the bulbous areas.
I'll often put clear coats between the layers of the color, and that what that does is promote depth to the finish also.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
it's a game changer.
It is. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and you can use. I mean, you can spray shellac for a sealer in between. It works really well.
Definitely.
Of course, works well. Yeah, you can brew up a batch of 2-pound cut shellac, throw it in your gun, and spray it just like you would lacquer. And dries really fast. It's not the nice thing about shellac. You're working in somebody's house. You don't have the toxic fumes that you do with lacquers or varnishes. You can spray shellac. It's alcohol, but that flashes off real quick. It doesn't linger in the air. You can evacuate the air real quick, and it's gone.
Nice thing about lacquer is within 20, 30 minutes, the house is cleared out anyways.
Sure, yeah. There's
of the fumes.
One little trick for using lacquer is don't use lacquer thinner for thinning it. Use acetone.
Okay.
A problem we usually have, though, is getting moisture trapped in the finish.
Yeah.
When you have the acetone. And so you need it. You need to introduce blush to the finish. No blush.
Blush inhibitor. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Either that or dry the air out real good.
Great. Hey, Kevin, let's see.
I live 100 feet from the ocean.
Good luck.
Kind of hard.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's give somebody else a chance here. I see that maybe Paul Duffield is now able to ask a question.
Oh, well, I don't want to take your time. Actually, what I wanted to do was just to thank you for such an outstanding presentation. I've learned so much by listening to you, and it's just added on to a lot of stuff that I knew and find it down. That's really nice stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, just so everybody knows, Roland was kind enough to allow us to record this, and it will be available on our website. And accompanying that will be the chat, which has been really rich with links and other insights. So those will go together onto our website. Roland, I know that we had talked about you maybe pivoting your laptop around so that we could give people a sense of what your shop is like. Sure. I think people love to see other people's shops.
Yep. Okay. Let's see what we've got here. I'll just kind of stand off the side. There's my main workbench. We'll turn my lighting down here. That's my main workbench, big heavy old beast that's been around a long time. Hovarder vise on one side, Lee Valley on the front. I've got a couple of bench crafted vices that are going on the back side of it. Kind of my back row, sanders, router table, radial arm saw, which I've used those forever, love them, best cutoff saw ever. My saw stop, sitting in the middle, my 18-inch Powermatic bandsaw. Beyond that, let's keep moving around. You can see way in the back, you can see stuff. I don't know if you can see me over here. I've got a 14-inch BX Laguna saw, a smaller saw, which is really nice to have. It's nice to have two bandsaws. I've got 5 of them. So it's nice. I wrote the book on bandsaws, so of course I got to have it. I put a new dust collection system in last year. I put in the Oneida Supercell. I really like it. It uses 4-inch pipe for the whole setup, high velocity, high volume. really does a nice job of getting rid of the dust. In the background here, that's my wood rack way in the back there. Let's see if we can get a good look at it. Let's do this. Let's just, if I don't make everybody seasick here. Okay, there's my wood rack. This is how I rack my wood, and I don't know if you can really see on the ends of it. When I put my wood up there, on the end of the wood, I write down the species of the wood and the length of the board. And that way, when I am looking for lumber, I don't have to go digging through the pile to find what I want. I've got the species on there. I can look at the end grain. I do a clean cut across the end so I can see the end grain. So I have a good idea what the face is going to look like. And that way the board may be buried in there, but I know exactly what I'm looking at for length and for the grain. And so then it's just a matter of downloading part of the pile, grab that board out, load it back up. It sure saves a lot of time digging it out. And then I've got bins underneath for all my cutoffs. And when I put them in there again, I label what the species is and what the length is so that I can go through there easily and pick it out. In the back corner here, I've got my wife's mini lathe and my big old Oliver lathe. Got my planer, 15-inch Powermatic helical head planer. And behind that, let's see, we got over here, we got my Shaper Origin.
Yay.
Love that tool. And over here, I've got my 8-inch General jointer, and it's got a Shellix head in it. It's been upgraded. And now over here, wander around, there's all my finishing materials, or a bunch of them. I've got my shellacs. It looks like a paint store. Both sides are filled with stains and dyes up on top, and my finishes, I've got a finishing room in the back where I mess around with it, and that's basically it. I've got a desk over here, and this is my Tay-Freed bench that I built out of recycled material 42 years ago.
Wow.
And that was from an article in Fine Woodworking magazine. They had the famous Tay-Freed bench. It's a great joinery bench. It's worthless as far as doing any heavy work like planing or anything like that on. It's too light a bench, but beautiful bench for doing joinery on. So there's the quick shop tour. This is, I have a lot of glass in the shop. That's looking out into my yard. It's a 4x8 window there. I like glass. There's my complete selection of Fine Woodworking magazine. Imagine that.
I imagine that.
Yeah, and we're back to the start again. So,
Hey, Roland, I have a question.
yes.
On your stored wood, I don't know how much wood you like to store or how often you turn it over, but do you have any problems with bugs?
No, I don't. No. You mean like powder post beetles, something like that?
Exactly, whatever. Or do you mostly buy kiln dried stuff?
Oh, well, if I buy air dried stuff, I have it kiln dried. I'll have it finished in a kiln, simply because I want to make sure that there's no infestation in it. I also want to make sure that I get it down to at least 8%, if not 6%. Right. And air drying, you have to maintain a 20-degree temperature differential between the ambient air and the air where you have the wood stored to be able to force it to dry down below. In our area, about 12% is about the driest that you can air dry wood, unless you induce an artificially higher temperature.
Thanks.
Okay, well,
sure.
We probably have time for one more question, but we should probably wind it down. It seems as though Larry, are you out there wanting to ask a question, Larry? Okay, apparently not. We have unanswered questions in the chat room. People have really loved what you've done. There's so many people still hanging on after almost 2 hours now. And it's just fantastic that you've done this for us. So
thank you.
On behalf of San Diego Woodturners and the Fine Woodworking Association and all our guest associations which have signed in from across the country. Thank you. And to everybody, just so you know, our next general meeting will be December 2nd. And as much as we'd like to have Raleigh back, it probably won't be Raleigh.
Maybe I'll just join in and watch.
There you go. You'd be welcome to. Well, Raleigh, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot, Travis.
Bye-bye.
Bye.